So really, when I'm asking you to do a long form drawing like this, I'm asking you not only to spend a lot more time on it than you would a sketch, but there also shouldn't be a lot of white space left on the paper. When you do a value drawing, almost the whole paper will be covered with some kind of value or some kind of shade. It won't be the white of the paper except for a few spots where there's a really bright highlight like a reflection or a glint. You might see some white there, but for much of the drawing, it should be just totally covered with something, a range of values to be sure. So you'll still have some really dark darks and some really light lights, but in most cases, on a final drawing that you've spent more than an hour on, there shouldn't be any white of the page left, or at least very little white of the page left. For a sketch, it's fine. In this week, we'll be doing two drawings, and on the sketch part of the assignment that we'll do where we'll draw forms, it's okay to have a lot of white left over on that because it really is just a quick sketch. You shouldn't spend more than 10 or 15 minutes on it. Whereas the longer drawing, which really will be the culmination of these last 7 weeks, it should look like you spent time on it, which means that you mapped your composition in, you spent time arranging your still life, and you covered the whole drawing with some amount of value. I just wanted to show you the photograph that I took and the still life that I set up in my studio that I'll use for this still life project. We have done some still lifes up to this point. Going back to Canvas, I just want to reiterate the idea that we're focusing on light and shadow in this still life in this project, and we're focusing on filling up the whole page. And like I mentioned, we've done a couple of different kinds of still life, and I realized that doing a lot of still life like this can get a little, I guess, boring, repetitive. But I want you to make sure that you kind of get the idea of creating form by utilizing light and shadow. So in my still life here, before I even work on it, I'm just gonna take a look at my rubric just to double check. I'm gonna start with doing a little negative space stuff. I'm gonna make sure I have all the full range of values. And for this project, first and foremost, really it's about light, observing light and shadow, identifying a light source, construct forms in drawing, and we're going to demonstrate cross-hatching techniques as well. So going back to my picture here, I want to sort of point out the idea that I really did go overboard with showing the light in my picture. You certainly don't have to do that with your picture. It's helpful if you can, but I just happen to have all these can lights in here. So I made sure that I was really showing you where my light source is coming from. There's another way to tell that, of course. There's the shadow, right? There's the cast shadow here where you could really tell where that light source is coming from, because it's coming from this point and then working around here, casting that shadow next to that, which I think is should be obvious in your drawing when you draw it, but in my case I just showed it here. You can tell that I have a pretty high level of contrast here between sort of the mid-tone and light shape and this very dark shape of my camera lens. I think too that I like the idea that I have a highlight here, kind of a mid-tone here, and sort of a darker tone here, and then maybe right down here I have a real core shadow that separates this, I don't know, this vase from the surface. In my case too, I have all these pieces of wood in my studio, so I happen to use them a lot as surfaces. So I think that I have the opportunity to perhaps put some of those details in there. I have some opportunity too to work with this texture going on in this vase here. And I may or may not add a lot of that texture, but I want to make sure that I add highlights here and midtones here, and then some real dark shadows here, and then there is some light coming in from the window on this side that I can add in too. You can see it up on the plant itself as well, where I have a highlight here, and then it's dark here, and I'm getting some of that window reflection into here. So these kind of become cylinders. If you can think about our exercise with drawing forms and light, I can break some of these shapes down, like like those branches, or this cylinder that makes up the lens is probably the easiest way to tell, where it's really lit here. There's a cast shadow. There's a darker shadow here, and then there's a mid-tone here. It really is just a cylinder. Perhaps the faces of these could reflect the cube that we made a little bit, because it's a lot less of a gradation and a lot more of a solid plane of shade here. What's nice about that is that I can just make these planes, and as they butt up against each other, those planes will be sort of creating these lines in between, but they won't necessarily be like heavily drawn lines or like really thick lines. They'll be much thinner, which I kind of like. They might be so thin that they're not even there. That's a possibility. So I also paid attention to the negative spaces. I wanted to make this shape, this negative shape in here, kind of squeeze around, and then I wanted there to be sort of a play with these pencils around the edge here, and I can go around it a little bit here. So I have my pen tool. I have this sort of sharp shape that I find pretty interesting, reaching out toward the light, and then as it's going across, it's going to duck back down again, leading to here, but also tucking back, making this shape too for my negative space, which I think is an interesting shape. For me too, these pencils kind of reflect the lean on this vase here, and perhaps even the lean on this vase here. So then I'm kind of thinking about what the negative space will look like in here. I'm going to decide how I'm going to frame that out when I actually put the... this might be a fun way to look at negative space. So you can start to see that negative space actually making a shape in itself, to help the viewer move around the subject or the subjects. You'll see it hopefully a lot easier when I start to draw it out, to give you a sense of how I really sketch this out at first, because I'll go really quick all the way across my page to really get a sense of what this might look like. This is, of course, a much more sort of intense, long-form drawing, but again, marks the culmination of everything you've learned up to this point. So I really hope you spend plenty of time on it. I took a picture of my still life here, and I have my still life just behind me over there, so I'll look at it as a reference from time to time, but I'll look at the picture a lot, probably more than I look at my still life itself. Keeping in mind that I'm not going to be looking at my actual drawing more than I'm looking at the thing that I'm drawing, the subject of my drawing, because the details of the thing that you're drawing won't sort of imprint themselves onto your mind until you look at it a lot. So every time you look at it, you'll get more and more details from it. So make sure that you're looking at it quite often in order to get all of the detail from it that you can. In my case here too, I'm going over sort of the whole thing to map it out. I want to figure out where my negative space is. And I'm even using some of the background to help me figure out where my horizon line is. And again, in this stage, it's just a sketch. Remember, drawing is progressive. Progressive just means that you are building up. You're not finishing it all in one go. You're building it up through a lot of sketch lines, a lot of quick changes, and I want you to change as you go. So change things, notice certain things, and then correct those things as you move along. In this case too, because it is a light assignment, I'm going to make sure that I'm getting these cast shadows pretty close to right, even on the first pass. Once I've got my map in, I'm going to add some more detail as I go. And again, I'm going pretty light with this because I want to be able to make changes as I move along. Like with this, I can tell that from my picture, probably my vase here isn't quite this tall. It's actually a little bit shorter, which means I'm going to bring my camera lens down a little bit. I'm making those corrections as I go. And again, I wouldn't be super overly concerned with making it super perfect. I'm just mapping it out. Once you have your map, you can start to add the dark spots. This is actually, I can see here that this line is closer to here. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that. And I can see that my negative space goes around this way. I have this really great dark versus light contrast happening here. This camera lens is pretty dark. And then there's a mid-tone here. And then this shadow is really nice here. And this shape here is pretty dark. I'm going to find these dark parts and these mid-tone parts. This is light here because the light source is coming from over there. I've got a pretty dark space here. And this vase. And I'm doing this with a pencil because I'm used to using a pencil for my sketching, but you can use other techniques too. For instance, you can use some charcoal to get some of these darker forms in. And really, I'm just finding the darkest parts of my drawing here. Some of the shadow. Charcoal's nice because you can get like a big chunk of it all at one time. You can use some lighter charcoals too to get some of your mid-tone. And this is a graphite stick, so it's just the same thing that your pencil's made out of essentially, but you can cover more ground. There's this nice texture that I have in here. And the side of this pot is very, very dark. So I want to make sure that I can get that contrast between the dark of the pot and even where this lightness of the table goes back here. So there's a lightness back here, and then the dark of the shadow here, and the dark of the pot. So I have a mid-range here. I'm going to bring my pencil back into it again too. So a mid-range going on here with this texture of this pot, going into that dark spot here. Really, the idea here is to get as much of your values in there as you can, and you're using all of the techniques that you have at your disposal to do that. There's this. You're finding the really dark spots, and you're adding those dark spots. You're starting with a sketch, and you're working up to a drawing. You can use charcoal, you can use pencils. Either way, you're using those same techniques to do it. If you have different hardnesses or softnesses of pencils too, getting the darker bits is all about using a soft pencil. So hopefully you can tell that my light source is coming in from over here and then casting a shadow over here, meaning that I have a lot of dark in my forms on this one side, and then I have a cast shadow going on over here. I'm going to keep going with this, and hopefully I get to a point where I feel like I'm done. And again, feeling like you're done is all about having the whole page covered. The whole page is showing some amount of value, even though it seems like some of it might be really light. Really, all of it's going to have some amount of value on it, where almost none of it's going to be completely white, except for where you have maybe like this part of the pencil is really shiny, so like that's probably got some amount of actual pure white from the paper on it. And it's all just about building up those values. Again, if you don't have charcoal, that's okay. I like to use charcoal for drawings like this, and if you want to pick some up, you can. Charcoal pencils are really nice too. You can still use just the same pencil techniques that we have been using. So keep going with this, and good luck.